About another minute? Doesn't matter. Let me see how's that? Okay. You ready? Okay. Hello, my name's Ron Parker. Hey! You're here to talk about identity and access management because I am complicated. I've been in the security space I've been saying 10 years for about 5 years now, so I think it's about 15, 12 years, something like that. I work at a large insurance company. We do disability, Fortune 250-something company. So we have a lot of regulation issues. We've got big company issues, enterprise issues, and we definitely work with identity and access management. And the reason we really wanted to put this together was because no matter what you're doing in security, if you don't understand what's going on behind these closed doors, you're missing out, because this is a lot of the heart of what should be happening with security. So that's kind of where we're going to go. Is I want to give you an overview in case you've never been exposed. Who's been exposed to identity and access management? Well, y'all might as well just leave then. No. So no, I was serious. No. So one day I was thinking, what do you normally think? I normally think burritos. I was sitting there thinking one day, I was like, man, I really want a burrito, but I can cook a burrito. I can do that. I don't have to go anywhere. I can cook a burrito. So of course I run in the kitchen. I grab all this stuff. Look at all this stuff I have. So I just, I pick up all the stuff that looks like it, might go into a burrito. Then I think, well, I need to go get something to cook this with. So I've got all my groceries together. So hey, I've got pots, I got pans, I got some spoons laying around, and so I can take all those things and start building my burrito. I cook everything, and basically, you know how you get one of those tortilla wrappers that are about that big. You lay it on the table and you start putting stuff in it. Everything that's smaller than a baby giraffe. You're putting that in there, and you're rolling up. You've got one foot up on the table. Then before you know it, oh my goodness, things went really wrong. You've overstuffed that burrito, and you can't even eat it because it's just a mess. So you're looking at this burrito and you say, hey, I've got more stuff. I think I'll try it again. And maybe your second time, it just doesn't look much better than the first. And by now you've kind of lost your appetite, and you decided, well, I'm going to kind of give up on burritos today. You walk back into the kitchen and you're looking at this going, man, did I have a mess, with this. There's just stuff everywhere. So what went wrong?
You did not have a plan.
Well, that's part of it. See, you can leave now. That's good. What went wrong? When I look, I made a mess because I may have not had the right ingredients or tools or the right skills, because you got to have all those things. But I've had a good burrito before. I know I have. So where did I get that good burrito? Where did that come from? So I sit and I think, welcome to Joe's. That was it. Joe's Burrito Barn. That's where I was at when I had a good burrito. And you look at that. When you look at Joe's, everything's all laid out nice and neat. They've got all the correct ingredients. It's all there for you. They can make a good burrito, right? But what do burritos have to do with identity and access management? I'm on page 38 of these slides. You're listening about burritos, but you came here to learn, something about security. So what we're looking at then is making a burrito consistently, making it efficiently, and even if you're at home, you don't want to make a mess that you have to clean up. I know I don't. That requires a lot of process. It requires, all those tools and things. Well, identity and access management, it has lots of parts. It needs lots of tools. It requires people and skills. Well, what does that mean? IAM is complicated just like burritos. That's why. So we can completely compare these things. So we can begin to look at, there's lots of pieces. How do I look at what's in common? How do I make things better? So let's kind of step over. And we've got Bob the Burrito. I don't know if you remember Bob the Burrito. I think he had a cousin at Microsoft. That might have been a paperclip or something. I can't remember. So he's got. We're looking at. So here we are. The reason that Joe's can build a better burrito is when you walk into Joe's, what do you see? You see a big menu. You see all these specialized stations. You see all these people at these stations, and they've got, steamers and grills and all that stuff all laid out. So they've got all the tools. They've got all the technology there. And so it really does boil down to that they have good people, good process and good technology all laid out. And when we think about that, it truly is three things, and it fits in most situations. Because when we look at the process, they have menus, they have recipes, they have HR processes where they pay people. They have people who've been trained. Have a steamer. I don't have a steamer at home. The closest thing I have at home is a microwave. So let's step into identity and access management and see how we can apply people, process, and technology to get something out of that. So when we look at identity and access management, it's a word that we all say, but we maybe not, or a set of words we all say, but maybe we don't think about it that much. There's many different ways to actually look at identity and access management. This particular view is stolen from Gartner. Okay, Gartner has a particular layout and the things that they call out that are important. And this is kind of their 4-point view. When we look at it then, there are really, underneath all this, and we're not going to talk about it that much right away, but it's intelligence. So when you look at how do you audit and gather and monitor and log and audit, that has to be built into the entire system. When we look at access management, that's really the setup. When you think about access management, that's everything that you need to do in order to get ready to do, what we would call security. That's the management piece. Access control is more of the runtime. So when we're looking at the access control, that is the authentication, the authorization, all the other policy, everything else that's running. Then Pam, I'm on the fence with Pam, and I'll tell you why once we get there. But Pam is really about how do we treat privileged actions, privileged accounts, privileged identities. And there are certain ways to do that, and that'll kind of become obvious as we go through. So why in the world do we need all of this? I've pointed all this stuff out, and why do we need it? We need it because when we're looking, people, the brand, your things and stuff, information, all of that is what matters to us. One may matter more than another, but we have to say, here's what's important. And identity and access management helps us figure out what's important. You may work with firewalls, you may work with network devices, switches, no matter what. You may work on physical door locks. But if you don't know what's more important to your company, you're wasting time because you're probably doing more or less than you should be. So identity and access management kind of helps us put the right controls in place. It drives all that policy and so forth. So we're going to look at access management first. And remember, access management was how do we set things up and get ready to go. 4 main areas that we're going to talk about, even though that there's a lot more to access management. We only have 50 minutes, so we got to do what we can do. So we're going to talk about these 4 major areas and walk through each one. The first one being a security model. So a security model is there because if you don't have a security model, that means you're doing identity and access management kind of in an ad hoc kind of fashion. You're just doing whatever you see that day. You're doing whatever you walk into a room and you're kind of looking around saying, hey, let's secure that. Let's secure this. that isn't going to be the most efficient way to approach it. You actually need to think about this ahead of time and put the effort in it. And part of that's picking out a security model. So we go back and we figure out what's important to us. Is it the people? Is it the brand? What is it? And then we think about what do we have as resources. Maybe I have alarm systems or HR payroll systems or PCI systems or whatever it is. Then I can think about, I can apply this model because it's going to tell me where to put the controls, where I need them, and it's going to tell me how to set the policy. And the three main things as security people that we hear over and over and over again is confidentiality, which is who should, really who should see what, that kind of thing. Integrity, is the data what it's supposed to be? Did the right people change the data? Lots of different definitions out there, and like I say, that's a whole another discussion. And then availability, which could cover everything from can they actually get to the data, securely and openly? Is it a denial of service attack or whatever stopping me from getting my data? Or am I having issues where I have a disaster recovery problem and I'm not able to get to my data? All of this falls into your security model. So let's run through a couple of security models just to kind of see what's there. The first one is probably the most common. That's usually a discretionary or direct, and it basically is you assign people to stuff, and you do it as needed. So if you need access to that file, you grant someone access to that file. And it's usually not based on rules or anything else. It's kind of very ad hoc. This is pretty common for smaller shops who just run in and do things as they want to do it. Mandatory access, I personally have never worked with a mandatory. Has anyone worked with a mandatory access control system at all? Anyone?
Maybe not in college.
That's what I thought. And that's really a much tighter system. It uses a combination of labels and attributes, and it basically goes to the individual and says, you can see secret stuff about the presidential race, and that's all you can see. And those labels tie you to what you can see. And if you want to, go look at SE Linux. SE Linux is a pretty amazing tool. It's just very hard to use if you don't know what you're doing. Very few companies use this, but I wanted to bring it up to show you that there are some like that. The most common we see today is some form of roles-based access and control, RBAC. That's the most common thing that we see in here. And it is all about, instead of assigning individuals, we make up groups, we make up buckets, and then we give those buckets or groups rights to do things. And that's the most, since that's the most common, that's the one we're going to use through this whole kind of example. And you'll hear things like LDAP and so forth. As we're getting into more cloud-based things, more, quote, modern with air quote things, you're going to see more attribute-based access control. That's where I use a piece of information that you may have to write a policy or a security rule. So I may look at you and say, you're in this department, and because you're in this department, you can do this action. So that is much more rules-based or policy-based, and you'll see a lot of that. There's also an example of attribute-based. You can use from a technical side or just a technical side, you would use something like SAML or OAuth. And I actually will show you one here in a minute, but you could actually look at that and take your location, and you should only see data from your location. Your location may be an attribute attached to your identity. So we pass your identity and that attribute, and then a policy system will make a decision about that later on. And I actually have a slide on that, which is good.
Kind of like adaptive authentication to a VPN or something, where you have attributes on the person when they try to log in.
Adaptive is a little bit, adaptive, you're usually making a risk decision at the time of authentication.
So that wouldn't be.
That's a little bit different. There are also lots of others, but they're all buried in the government. If you do government work, they're out there. So let's look at Joe's again. On one side, we see resources. On the other side, we see users. This is simple as it can get. So I've got Rick, Maggie, and Carl. Rick is a manager, and Rick can do the alarms, he can do HR, he can operate the point of sale system, whereas Maggie and Carl can only do what point of sale. They can run the cash register and do that type thing. So you look, all those lines are actually their rights, their permissions, their entitlements. That's what they can do. The problem is, if we go to add another person like Eugene, we add Eugene to the mix, and now I've got to take and add 1, 2, 3 more lines, and this is a made-up scenario. If it was a real-world scenario, there could be 10, 100, there could be just lots and lots of these lines. So we have to look again at our resources and our users and think, how do we gather those up to use a role-based model? So we begin to look and say, I've got managers, and those managers can do these 4 things. I've got a crew, and they can really only do that one thing. So these we call entitlements. And entitlements is it's a big word that, depending on where you're at, could mean a lot of different things. But we're really looking at it, it could be your authorizations, your permissions, your rights. It really comes down to, it's what you can really do at some level. And that's the basis for access control. What you can do is really all about access control, because you can think about, in all these other things, talks we've listened to, it's all been about, how do we keep people from getting in the firewall? How do we keep people? Well, how do you know? How do you know that they can come in or can't come in? And that's all a part of this entitlements model and all part of identity and access management. So once we have those two, we can then come back and redo our picture to put the manager there, to put the crew there. Then I can assign Rick to the manager role, and I can assign Maggie to the crew role. Then everything else gets assigned to the actual role. See, that's a total different deal. I'm not giving Rick the direct rights to operate the alarms. Rick can only operate the alarm because he's a member of the manager group. And the reason that this matters, it's a level of indirection, and because it's a level of indirection, it lets us mess with one side or the other without actually changing the middle a whole lot. So we see now, if I come back and I want to add Eugene, now I've only got to add 1 line to get Eugene back into the mix, not 3 lines. And this is a really simple example. Let's think if we had 50 roles and 100 people or 500 people. This becomes basically it becomes a rat's nest. So what's really going on? If we look at what's really happening, there's a lot going on when you hear me saying casually we have roles and so forth. Let's look. Let's see if I have that user. Let's say I have Negan, who's a user. What does that mean? I've got Negan, and we haven't even talked about it, but all of a sudden I've got to have an identity. I've got to figure out how to figure out who Negan is. So I need an identity, and I need to be able to add Negan to a group. Well, that means I need a group. So I go create and determine that role. I have to actually add the actual, whether it's what system I'm using, whether it's Active Directory or whatever I'm doing, I have to create that group. Then I have to relate that group to the resource. So when you look, even though we're casually saying RBAC, there's a lot of stuff that happens to actually make that whole process work. And since I mentioned identities, who has an identity in here? Oh, come on. We all know we do. Who has at work? Do you have 1? Do you have 2? 3? Does anybody have more than 3? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, not the ones you bought off the street. Yeah, yeah. So when we talk about identities, we're really talking about the primary digital piece that allows you to connect to an entity. Whether that entity is a person or that entity is a system, that identity is the digital piece that's the connection. And usually with a company, you want to minimize the number of identities you have for an individual. Because if you take a normal worker and you bring them in and you give them 12 identities, that means you've got 12 passwords, you've got 12 everything that you have to keep up with. And that's usually not a good idea, for normal work. So you'll see identities, and we try to keep that as one. So you look, Rick is there as a person. Rick has a single identity at Joe's. It's rick@joes.com. But because we use other systems, whether they're commercial, off-the-shelf off-the-shelf things, whether we use cloud-based systems like Salesforce, Workday, Dropbox, you name it, we may also have to have accounts in those other systems. Because I don't own those systems and I don't completely control them. I control, as a company, I may control the identity for Rick, but I don't control all the accounts that I may have to set up for Rick. So there is a relationship that you have to keep between Rick, his identity, and all the accounts he has to keep. Does that make sense? The excitement's building, I know. So when we look, that brings a lot into play. That you start having to ask yourself, how do I create those accounts? How do I maintain those accounts? How do I keep passwords on those accounts? Do I even keep passwords on those accounts? And so as we begin to start designing our identity and access management system, we have to look and figure out what attributes do I need to keep for identities. When we look at that list, it's going to be primary things that help you identify that entity. It's going to be, names, employees, departments, emails, that kind of stuff. With the account, it could be different because you don't control that. So what you may see over there is preferences. You may see things like, limits on, if I'm writing checks, maybe there's a limit on the amount of checks. Maybe I can only write a $100,000 check. Maybe I can write $1 million check. And a lot of times that is kept in the account information. But the important piece is you have identities and you have accounts, and they're both collections or directories of those pieces. And speaking of directories, since the 80s or whatever, the phone company and other communication systems, they had a need for directories. So over a period of 10, 20 years, we basically went through an evolution of different types of directories that are out there, and we ended up with a usable protocol and a usable technology that we just generally call LDAP, which is really a protocol, but it's also a lightweight directory, and that's basically what we use now for the majority of identity and access management work. And what it is a hierarchical database that's object-oriented, more or less, object-based, and it's set up to read and be very efficient at it. It's set up in such a way that it identifies each object in a unique way and returns that object quickly. So if I have identities, I can put them in there. If I have these entitlements and rights and groups, I can put them in there. Some examples of those things, you may have heard of, Open LDAP, Active Directory, OpenDJ, Radiant, Radiant One. There's a whole list. If you want to actually look or work with one, you just go out and find any of these free and open source ones to work with. If you want to work with LDAP on your own and set it up, it's really easy. So when we look at the hierarchy.
Hang on one second. What did you mean by can be SQL?
No, they're not all SQL based. They're actually proprietary. A lot of them are proprietary file formats, and you get some that are SQL based with an LDAP interface on top of it. But the reason that they're not SQL based is, and as a matter of fact, let me go to when you look, like if we were to look, I've got people and I've got groups. If you were to look and see Carl actually has a path just like a file has a path. And it's a very unique name identifier. And LDAP is set up to where it can quickly pull that record out of the database, unlike SQL, where every SQL operation that you do is a whole query and a whole build and a whole relational operation. This isn't. This is cached differently and works completely different under the covers. But some companies actually provide SQL they're able to take your SQL database and make it look like LDAP. And there's a lot of companies that do that. Radiant Logic and Radiant One is an example who can take your SQL database and turn it into an LDAP, using an LDAP interface. So the whole point of this is we can arrange our people, arrange our entitlements, arrange our groups to where they can be accessed quickly in one directory. And as we begin to look at all this and you start asking, I've got all these things. When I hire a new employee, if you're new, what do you get? You don't get just an ID. I have to get you a phone. I may have to get you a very small depressing cube. I may have to get you, I may have to get you other accounts. I may have to do all those things. And I don't really want to do it manually, because if I do it manually, that means I have to have a whole team of people doing that. So what we call this is provisioning. And provisioning is actually, it's the act of creating all that stuff to get a new person or a new change in place. And what we have to watch for is how do we not do this manually? Because there are way too many mistakes that could be made in a manual process. So how do we do this efficiently? If we go back and look at Joe's, remember when you walked into Joe's restaurant, there was a menu. And that menu, you're used to doing it all the time. You'll drive up to Burger King, you drive up to Joe's and say, "Hi, I want a number 3." And they'll say that'll be $8.92, and they give you your McBurrito or whatever, and you're ready to go. That's because they've already worked out what people normally want. They know that, if you want a vegan burrito, they take out everything that's any good and they wrap it up in something green and they hand it to you. That's usually, that's kind of the way that works. From a company standpoint, the service menu is going to have things like, you're a new hire, you're a new employee, maybe you're a new manager. Maybe I need to transfer you. You were a crew member, now I'm going to promote you to manager. All of those things are repeatable workflows. They're repeatable processes. So much so that Identity and Access Management actually calls them that. There's actually workflows that we can set up that have the task and all the pieces and the checks and the audits to make all of this happen. And the workflow systems will actually do this for you. And there's big and small ones that'll do this. Everything from Oracle's, CA, there's lots out there. There's 20 or 30 large ones, all the way down to the much smaller open source ones. You can build one of these workflows to help reduce the mistakes and help do everything else that you need to do. So when we look at the entire life cycle of the management, and this is probably the most important picture in the whole thing, because this kind of gives you the recap, is I need to take a person or entity or system all the way through. And so that means I need to work out the security model. I need to get them into the identity and access management system. I need to do provisioning and so forth. Two pieces that we didn't talk about, for example, is governance. And if you look up here, who has ever had to work with attestation? Yay, attestation. Attestation is really part of the whole governance system where you come back in and you're really just making sure that the people who have certain entitlements should have them. So you're asking their boss, you're asking them, should this person be able to do this? Should this person have this right or that right? And that's a part of the governance process. The other important piece on here is termination. Another reason you want automated workflow is if I quit, run out for whatever reason, I want to make sure that I completely remove any security rights, entitlements that I may have had. And if you start moving forward into the cloud, think about it. If I have Salesforce, Workday, a Box account, maybe I've got 20 accounts in the cloud. Well, you don't want to undo all that manually. Plus, you've got to remember all of it. So your identity and access management system needs the ability to remove someone from everything, not just, the systems you have on premises. It really needs to go the whole route. So termination is a big deal. This leads us to, now that we've got people set up, we've got their stuff provisioned, we actually need to look at actually accessing material. How do we actually get real, this is what people think security is. This is the part that when you think about security, this is the logging on, this is the, accessing resources. So we're in the red circle now, and this is the runtime piece. It includes authentication and authorization as the main parts. And if you really break it down, just two things? If you really break it down, that's it. That's all we're really talking about today in this section's access control is authentication and authorization. But once you get inside, we're going to start seeing things like federation and single sign-on and multi-factor and adaptive. It really turns out to be a very large area, even though it's just two things that you have to do. So let's start off by beginning to drink. Oh, good time for a question.
What's federation?
Federation is actually, can be a part of authentication or authorization, and we'll be here in just a second. I've got a good deal on that. So let's look at authentication. Authentication really is that process of connecting the entity. It's a process of connecting the entity, whether the entity is a person or whether the entity is a system. You need to connect it to that digital identity. And you do that through the process of that entity taking and passing credentials to some authentication system. The authentication system then checking in that LDAP directory or that repository that we talked about to actually see if they match. I can stand up and say, I'm Ron. I've identified myself as Ron. I'm Ron. That doesn't mean much until I actually prove that I'm Ron. So authentication is really when I pull out credentials and I can prove that I'm Ron, and you then believe me that I'm Ron. So once we go through this whole process of declaring who you are, handing over credentials, validating those credentials, you eventually get some type of token or session or something that comes back that says, yes, you were authenticated. Lots of stuff goes on when you enter that ID and password. So as we look, one of the things you're going to see is single sign-on or reduced sign-on. Single sign-on really is when you go through that same process of handing over your credentials, becoming authenticated. You get a session, and if you look at the picture here, we go through this whole deal where we're talking to the authentication system. The difference is I can go from one back-end system to the next back-end system to the next back-end system without re-entering my ID and password again. The authentication system, through the use of a cookie or some other kind of header, whatever it does, and there's lots of different ways, it maintains your session and maintains your identity so the user doesn't have to log on again. Does anyone here use a single sign-on system? Does anyone here use Active Directory as their main network? If you're using Active Directory, you're actually using a single sign-on system from Microsoft for Microsoft products. You are using one, and it's actually quite complicated and has Kerberos and all kind of other stuff underneath. What was that? Go away. So when we look then, what's reduced sign-on? Reduced sign-on you may hear about. Reduced sign-on is basically where I use a single LDAP system or something that looks like a single LDAP system, and I use the same ID and password, and I can get into a lot of back-end systems. I may have to put in my ID and password more than once, but I don't have to remember multiple IDs and multiple things like that. So what is this?
Looks like fog of war.
Fog of war? That's close. This is the fog of federation. So when we look at this, one thing federation is, federation's where you kind of know where you're at. You kind of know where those people are at over there. But there's a lot that goes on in between that you may not can see or may not can know about. So when we begin to look at federation, we have to see all the parts. On the left-hand side, you'll see there's a security boundary. And that boundary could be your company. It could be a system. It could be a Linux world. It could be lots of things. But let's pretend that's a boundary. And say there's another boundary, another company that you need to work with. And in order to exchange security information, one of the first things you have to do is put a trust in place. So you're basically going to say the left-hand side trusts the right-hand side, and you may pass back and forth some certificate information to kind of prove who you are. But first of all, to get a federation to work, you set up a trust. And that may be internal. Maybe you need to get your Linux system to trust whatever. But let's pretend this is two companies. So we've exchanged certificates. We trust each other now. That means once I have an entity on my left-hand side, here, once they authenticate with the identity provider, is that a question? Oh, okay, I thought you had a question. Once I authenticate, I can then send a token over to the right-hand side that says, this is Ron. He's from a trusted place. You don't have to authenticate him again. So that the authentication says it's kind of like a little Jedi, over there. He's okay. You don't have to authenticate him again. As he comes across.
But that trust you set up is between systems, not per user, right?
Not per user.
You set the trust up.
That's right. You set the trust up once, and you say, I'm going to trust the left-hand side. And so that means me as a user, I don't have to log in but once. I log in with my company, then because I'm trusted, I don't have to log in again. I just basically get a token sent over that says, this is Ron, and we're kind of done.
What is the mechanism there for the shared trust initially, generally speaking, like in Microsoft Federation Services? Like, I'm not familiar with it, so what is that? Is it generally assessed?
The mechanism is almost always now, it's PKI certificate.
Okay.
It really is. I mean, a long time ago, we did shared key stuff and all that, then that's no good now. So now it really is certificate based. And it's pretty easy to do since you can have the whole, you share your public and do all that, and it's pretty straightforward.
So is SSH key authentication falling under this umbrella then? Even though
SHK, yes, that's a little bit different. That's almost like keeping your ID and password. That's really all that is when you do SSH key sharing, it's almost like an ID and password that you just can't see that it passes automatically. Yeah, it's a little bit different. This trust, we'll see there's a lot more to it as we go through what it does. But the important piece is on the right-hand side, they trust the information that gets sent over. And we have to step back a little bit, and that means that it kind of matters about assurance. When I look at assurance, do I really know who you are saying you are is really, who you are? And there's a level of assurance there that we have to look at as we go through all this to figure out, do I just take your word on it? Can I take social logins? Can I trust Gmail? Do I need a password? Do I need biometrics? Do I need a one-time password? And as you go through that all the way up to those high-level government biometric, portable machines, which is the top of the line, what's that level that you need in order to assure? And this is where we get multi-factor. This is where all that comes into play. What do you need to do? From a multi-factor standpoint, what do you need to do to raise your assurance? And probably the largest things, one of the easiest things you could go do is to get it's a hard read, I'll be honest. NIST puts out a publication. It's like a NIST 6, I've got it written down, 863, that really is about authentication and authentication levels. And it walks you through what it means to raise that assurance level. And if you've never read it, it's an interesting read because a lot of times people don't think about multi-factor and all that in that context. So once we set that level of assurance, we can now get into the part about what can you do. I know who you are. What can you do? And the what can you do may be based on what group you're in. It may be based on a direct assignment. Maybe I've given you personally rights to see this particular file or execute this particular service. It may be based off an attribute. You can only run this service if you're in this department. It may also be based off an assertion, and an assertion is just something I say. Ron can run payroll. That's an assertion. It could be rules-based and code-based. So when we look at that from a logical to runtime standpoint, there is a lot that goes on. We have to take all that theoretical stuff that we talked about earlier on. We've got to map it to something, digital, physical. We've got to make stuff happen. So that's why when we look at things like, everybody's seen this, right? You go, you do a list on a Linux box or whatever. You see all this garbage. Well, that garbage is actually what's happening with the user. What can a user do with this file? What can a group do with this file? Those are actually the permissions at the file level for that particular file system. So we have to not only deal with who you are, but we have to deal with that. We have to deal with, if I'm going to Amazon, I have to determine and figure out how to write a policy. This particular policy basically says that anyone is allowed to read objects out of Joe's bucket of data. I have to figure out how do I write those types of policies. How do I write SAML? And this particular SAML assertion says I've got a user named Rick at Joe's. I have to figure out how do I translate my entitlements to SAML, to Amazon, to Linux.
Can you speak to the difference in an assertion and the entitlement?
Yes. An entitlement is the high-level logical piece. So I'm entitled to do something. I have rights to do it. The actual assertion is much closer to the implementation of that entitlement.
And it may be language or platform.
Language or platform specific. So entitlement's high level. Assertion is an actual implementation of an entitlement. And one more, OAuth. OAuth, very mobile API centric. You've got to learn how to do that also. So now back to federation. Now that we've got all these different ways of passing, these are just hundreds of different ways of passing these entitlements around. Remember, we had a trust set up between left and right. You're already authenticated, so I know who you are. And so now I want to say, here's what Ron can do. Here's what Ron can do. Well, I federated over the person, the identity. I can also federate over the authorizations. In that same token, I can put authorization information just like I put identity information. And that's usually where you see things like SAML, JWT, OAuth, a lot of JSON, XML type stuff. That's where you see that pass over. But the important piece is, once you get that trust in place, you can move both of those across, both of those that way. Which brings up the fact, when we start looking at all these pieces, there's a lot of pieces. And it breaks down to 3 or 4 main components. I have to administer those entitlements. I have to keep them somewhere in information. I have to make a decision on them, and I have to enforce it. And you've probably seen this before. You've probably seen, has anyone seen PIP, PAP, PEP, all that stuff? That really is a policy-based way of talking about authorizations. What happens when an entity wants to get to a resource? The decision point, which is the actual rules, the smarts, the thinking part, has to go get information about you and then make a decision and give it to the enforcement point to let the enforcement point raise the gate or close the gate. This model works everywhere. You'll see this model in anything that has an authorization. And those blue pieces are like an accordion. Sometimes pieces come over here, sometimes pieces go over there. So let's look. Disco night at Joe's Burrito Barn. Every time that they have disco night at Joe's Burrito Barn, people line up around the block to get in. It got so bad, what they actually had to do was they had to put a bouncer out in front of Joe's. Not a good thing, but just to keep the peace. So we put put a bouncer out in front. Let's just call him Abraham, just as a random name. Abraham out in front. Abraham is sitting in front of Joe's, and he is not only going to make the decision and be the enforcement, he has all the information. So let's say Carol came up to the front and said, hey, I want to get in Joe's. Abraham then has to look and think, do I know Carol? Am I going to let Carol in? Do I open the door so she can get to the burrito? That's one way that all these things line up and down. But we could turn around and say, well, that got too complicated. Maybe Abraham doesn't know everyone, so let's hand out tickets. I could hand tickets out to break up the enforcement and all that to where Abraham is looking to see if you have a ticket. So if you purchased a ticket from somewhere like an OAuth token, that OAuth token is just like an OAuth token. Abraham is going to look and say, oh, you've got a ticket. I'm going to make a decision, let you get to the burrito. And finally, the last one is, these are just examples. Let's say Carol comes up to Abraham. The only thing Abraham is doing, he's the enforcement point. He doesn't make any decisions at all. So he picks up the phone. He calls up to the manager, Rick, and says, hey, Rick, do you know Carol? And because he's the information point and the decision point, he makes the decision on whether Carol can come in or not. Abraham enforces it. So as crazy and silly as this looks, this happens all over. And if we as security professionals don't understand where is the information, where's the decision made, what's the enforcement point, we'll not be able to either protect or defend whatever that is. Because usually you want your enforcement point close as possible to your resource, because that gives less space for somebody to fall into the cracks and break your security. So let's look at a real example. This is Active Directory with Kerberos. And this is loose. This is kind of loose. We have a local Active Directory. We've got a domain controller. We've got people. We've got a back-end system. When a person logs on and begins to work, the decision point's actually the domain, the domain controller, the Kerberos server. All the information's coming out of Active Directory, which may be on a completely different box. So you can see all of that's there, but the enforcement point is where? The enforcement point is actually at the server with the operating system, and it may be next to the file. That's where it actually rejects you and kicks you out. So when we look at a cloud model, how many people are using cloud services today? How many people are using cloud identities, cloud accounts, and all that kind of stuff? Okay. So let's look at this cloud single sign-on model.
You mean like burrito.com?
Burrito.com. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's good. So this cloud single sign-on model is I have a person, and I break all these up because I'm actually going to a cloud provider, and the cloud provider's making the actual decision for me and letting me log on and authorizing for me. But I may be keeping my administration on premises. I may be keeping my administration in Active Directory, and it may be synchronizing.
And the CEO has to log in to Facebook Connect. Lucky that he can remember that password.
Yeah. One of the things that we see with these models, these are like, yeah, that's right. One of these things, they are like Okta, one login. Microsoft Azure has an Azure Active Directory piece. And if you want to talk about those, like say after this talk, come talk to me about it. We've looked at a lot of it. Do what?
Seriously, Google Apps for Business.
Google Apps for Business that's a big deal. So as we look through here, then all together now with the picture, just like we did with access control, we've got access management. How does access control work? Basically, you've got to be authenticated, then authorized to actually get to a back-end resource. And you can do that either through on-premises work, through cloud work, many different ways. And the important piece with this picture is this federation piece here has been optional for most of us for a long time. For the last how many ever years that it's been around, it's been optional, but not really anymore. If your business is out, as you see more of, we're going to the cloud or we're working more with third parties, we in this room need to know how do we protect federated systems, how do we use federated systems. We need to understand SAML, we need to understand OAuth, we need to understand what an entitlement is, assertions.
But in the driver for that federation, the fact that we can't afford to maintain all of those items.
We can't afford, well, that's not the only driver. Another one is we're actually connecting with more outside people. We're composing our businesses. We're composing our businesses now instead of doing it all in-house. And that's a lot different than it was 10 years ago, where everything was kind of in-house and built in-house. Now you've outsourced your HR, you've outsourced your security, you've outsourced other pieces, and you need to make those connections. So I would, if it was me, I would become a federation, specialist if you really want to be a good security integrator or whatever moving forward. Because that's where the work is going to be. The work is going to be there to make it happen, and the work is going to be there to secure it. So you have to understand a little bit about identity and access management, and there's a lot there about security. PAM we didn't mention much about, because PAM is hard to explain until you actually know more about identity and access management. What we've got to do with PAM is basically watch what privileged people are doing. Whether it's system accounts or real people, if it's an administrative action, we need to really watch what they're doing. What's the most, other than Active Directory type stuff, what are some type of administrative accounts that we need actions we need to watch? Anybody?
Log initialization.
Service accounts. There's one that's huge now that didn't really exist 10 years ago. One that's huge. With the move to virtualization, when you think about your administrators who can get to those consoles, get to the virtualization systems that can literally, I know for us, we're 95% virtualized. So if you take one of those administrators who can get to one of those consoles, they could literally shut down your company from one spot. And that would be unheard of back in the hardware days. So we've got to figure out, how do we architect things, how do we watch things, how do we put systems in place to watch, audit, monitor these accounts. And there's a lot of systems out there. CyberArk is probably one of the larger ones that does this kind of thing. But at the end of the day, we also have to think about, how do I do PAM in the cloud? How do I watch actions that are happening in the cloud? And that hasn't been really solved yet. That's not all the way there, but it's coming.
Ron, is this PAM the same as the PAM in Linux?
No. The PAM in Linux several years ago, Linux came out and said, hey, people might want more different kinds of security than just our password file. So they came out with these pluggable authentication modules, pluggable whatever, and they gave you an ability to extend the security system of Linux.
So that's different than
this is totally different. This is a generic word for privileged access.
I'm far less confused now.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I'm sorry I didn't say something. The intelligence piece is really about what's happening in the rest of these classes. How do we log? How do we monitor? How do we audit all the flow and everything else going on? And that's why I didn't really go over a lot of that here, because that's what we're talking about in some of these other rooms. So the summary of all this is there's 4 main areas: access management, access control, PAM, and intelligence. And what you need to do first, on a lot of this, is get your standards straight, get your rules straight. You got to get all that. And basically that's it. And if you go to www.secretchipmunk.com by tomorrow, I'll put this up there, and you can grab the presentation, or ask me about it. I'm SC Monk on Twitter. Just connect up and shoot me a note. And actually, I can talk about, if you want to talk about any of this, I'll talk about this stuff all day long. Whether it's identity access management, PAM, development, coding, JavaScript, D&D, barbecue. I said all that. Yeah. Thank you very much.